Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on integrating public health and well-being into the geosciences. My name is Gabe Filippelli. I'm a professor of earth sciences and I direct the Center for Urban Health at IUPUI. This area of GeoHealth is an exploding one. It came on the scene several years ago in recognition to a number of pressures that the geosciences and the health sciences were facing. And it's probably the best exemplified by the newest of the AGU journals, which is called GeoHealth, which curates this field of science. And it is also related to a GeoHealth section at AGU, which sponsors this particular tutorial. This GeoHealth field is gotten quite popular and quite a bit of press. In fact, the journal itself won the National Prose Award in 2019. It's a best new journal in science and medicine. And as many of us who are seeking funding, for example, or training opportunities in the sciences know, convergent science is all the rage. So it's converging viewpoints and findings from very disparate areas to make new discoveries. Now, in a nutshell, the purpose of GeoHealth is to better integrate the currently disparate fields of the environmental sciences, environmental earth sciences, which many of the AGU members represent. So the study of air, water, and soil and cycling of materials between these, and human health. We know that one's long-term health and well-being is related to two factors and two factors only, and that's genes and environment. We are starting to chisel away at the gene portion of this, but we are still at very early stages understanding environmental pressures on individual health or population health. And that's because these areas have long existed in silos. There's different disciplines that study the environmental processes versus those that study human health. There are different data archiving repositories, and there's, of course, very different funding models and societies that do that. So that means that our information that we get as earth scientists often is so diluted that by the time it gets to the health sciences as to be ineffective at understanding environmental impacts on health. Similarly, the findings of health practitioners and clinicians and others about disease or death doesn't filter in very well to our understanding on the earth sciences, environmental sciences, of how to better understand the environmental triggers for some of these things. So we're left with two very powerful communities that are not talking adequately to each other. And that's what spawned the birth of GeoHealth. That's not saying that the field has come directly out of the blue as of 2 years ago when the journal started, or last year when the section started, but rather that more and more of the members of AGU were interested in crossing this divide. And so the GeoHealth journal and sections were formed to better integrate research, training, and discovery in between these sectors of environment and health. I'll give you one example of how you go about doing this. And this is a personal example. It's one that's easier for me to talk about, at least. And it's my personal journey. No, you're not going to hear my lifetime sagas of growing up in the Sierra Nevada wilderness, but rather you're going to hear my academic research story. And it's probably best exemplified by giving a snapshot of some of my current work, and then frame how I got to that point in my research journey. We have been aware for quite a while that lead poisons. We've used lead in many products over the last particularly century. Having said that, the Romans even used it as well. But over the last century, we've used it in paint to make lead-based paint. We use it in gasoline to make leaded gasoline, and often in pipe and water fixtures. We have been paying the price for that profligate use of lead, and really our children have been paying the price for quite a long time. This is an example of how lead impacts an individual's brains. This is a composite brain scan of about 150 control and research patients who were part of something called the Cincinnati Lead Study. These were kids who were lead poisoned at birth, or not soon after birth, and they followed them up for decades afterwards. And when they put these kids into these scans, these are teenagers, and tested their attention, tested their ability to think quickly, tested their memory, they showed marked deficits. Those areas in red there and yellow, those things that are not gray, were deficits in brain function compared to the control population that were not lead infected. Unfortunately, these are all in the frontal lobes, the frontal cortex, the very part of our brain that inhabits our memory, that inhabits our, which is tightly linked to our IQ, our intelligence. That very part of the brain that controls our responses, that tells us when our animal brain sees a plate of brownies and wants to eat all of them, this part of the brain tells us no, that would be very bad for us in the long run. This is the reasoning part of the brain. And these teenagers are showing exactly what happens, that unfortunately that part of the brain is permanently disabled. Those colored spots are low brain mass, low neural mass, because this lead attacks the neurons permanently. What this does is lowers IQ markedly of people, permanently also. It lowers their aversion to risky behavior, and it increases depression and other mental health issues. And it's probably no surprise to know that people who are lead affected not only end up earning less money than those who are not, but they also overwhelmingly populate our prison systems because of the coupled characteristics of lowered IQ and higher propensity for risky behavior. So this is a profound problem which has not gone away. Certainly anyone who's seen the news of Flint, Michigan recently that had a catastrophic lead poisoning incident, epidemic from bad water management can attest to that. But this lead poisoning is happening in our very cities today, tomorrow, and will continue until we solve the problem. Here's an example of where we see it in the modern face of a city. This is a city of Indianapolis, a city of close to 1 million people. This is a composite examination of 16,000 blood lead tests for children. Every red or yellow or orange spot you find there is a lead poisoned child. And you can see that it has a shape to it. There are neighborhoods that are more lead poisoned than others. And the sad part about this figure is that this trend has continued for at least the 20 years that people have been measuring this factor. So in this map looks very similar to one that you could have made 20 years ago. So we haven't made much headway in terms of eliminating the major sources. What we discovered in looking at this map is most of this lead is coming from lead in soils, contaminated lead in soils, which is redistributed as a function of meteorological factors. So if you have a lot of lead in soils and you get dust resuspended from that, you can have this profound impact on children. We were able to use this finding to examine how do you solve this problem. So we were able to start transforming some of our geoscience research into some solutions for clinicians. And this is an example of one where you could see that if a child happened to come into the clinic in December, the line to the right, they would show pretty low blood lead levels. Yet it was likely that in the summer before, they would have been considered lead poisoned. So we were able to use this kind of clear temporal trend to inform clinical practice here in Indianapolis, and a couple clinical networks are now using this to better understand the past history of the individual patient when they are there in the clinic, so that they're better able to diagnose these issues. But we didn't want to just stop there. This map is the reason why this map I consider a very sad map is we're just mapping out the distribution of permanently lead poisoned children. We're not getting at the heart of it. So knowing that most of that lead exposure comes from dust that comes from soil, we've been focusing in smaller and smaller spatial levels to understand what is the spatial texture and variability of lead in neighborhoods. We started off using the booming urban garden growth that has been occurring over the last decade or so in Indianapolis and many, many other cities in the US. And we were able to actually go into communities and work with community gardeners and community farmers to better assess their risk. This is a typical community in Indianapolis where everything that is red and orange is basically lead contaminated soil. And as a result, children living or playing near there are lead exposed. So we were able to use these findings, for example, and inform a number of community gardeners about how to better attend to their practices of managing their gardens and avoiding lead exposure, certainly in the food they produce. And we were able to do that largely through some of these initiatives, like our Safe Urban Gardening Initiative, where we're making learning tools for normal human beings, not just for other scientists. So I'm going to back up here a little bit and explain, how did I get there, from there to here? How did I get to where I'm working with clinical networks and working with communities to try to stem this tide of lead poisoning? Well, I started off in geology. My undergraduate degree was in geology, and my PhD was in oceanography and paleoclimate. But some of my interests were evolved over the last 15 years, largely through this evolution I've seen nationally in the United States, at least, of people being more and more concerned about the environment, and more concerned about the net impacts of environmental contaminants on their own health and on their children's health. So over the last 15 years, I've been bridging this transition from geologist to human health or environmental health researcher. Having said that, I still work in paleoclimate and publish in that, and am funded in that. But I get a lot of excitement from working with communities on some of the issues that are there day to day, instead of just looking at something paleoclimate interval from 2,000 years ago or 2 million years ago. So I want to walk through the steps of how you can get here too, if you choose, in a basic GeoHealth 101. And so in here, I'd like to lay out just very briefly what I've learned the hard way through going through this process to maybe jumpstart your own foray into GeoHealth research, if that's where you're interested in heading. Now, one of the very first things I learned, and it's very important, but it's usually not done by environmental scientists, is to engage with communities and gain partners and learn the language of what communities need. So why is that important? I'm out there trying to map out in very high detail the granular texture of soil and dust lead exposure in communities. I can't just go in people's backyards and start digging up dirt or collecting dust. I have to engage with communities to explain what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and also to gain community partnerships in order to facilitate that kind of work. As a university professor, there is not a lot of we don't have a lot of free time on our hands to hang out places and talk, but that's really what you need to do. And one of the ways I've done that is to gain community organization partners who are able to facilitate that dialogue. The second lesson is to work with communities and not on them. I've seen this mistake propagated time and time again, where researchers will come in, make some vague partnerships with communities and measure their air, soil, or water, go away and publish their research in journals and consider the job done, leaving the community feeling used and also leaving them completely uninformed of the science that has now arisen and the knowledge that's arisen. There aren't many community individuals who are reading the journal GeoHealth or Nature or Environmental Science and Technology. So what I find with working with communities is that I try to develop very strong research partners. So rather than thinking of me as a researcher and the community as the subject, the community is actually one of my research partners. And so I practice, and many people who do this kind of work really work very strongly at how do I translate my research, the research I did with my partners, into ways that'll help the community. And the way I do that is not to just give a PowerPoint presentation and leave. It's rather I usually engage partners with explaining vaguely what the research results were and work with them to say, well, how would you explain this result? So they actually become the explainers in chief of the research, and it's a pretty powerful tool. It forces you as a university professor or university researcher to step back a little bit, because they might not always be saying things that are exactly right technically, but sometimes the technical aspects don't really matter, frankly, when you're trying to improve communities. It's the ability to hear information, to engage with that information, and to take action. And so you'll hear these terms: community engaged research, participatory action research, and so forth. It's all ways of saying the same thing: work with communities, not on them. Also, health data is special. Earth scientists and environmental scientists are very used to just going out and taking a water sample, dirt sample, rock sample, bringing it back to their lab and analyzing it. Of course, you can't do that with people. People have rights, unlike rocks. And health data is special. They have rights not only to their access to their own tissues and material, but they have rights to how that's presented and how they might be associated with that. Some health data is protected, some is not. For example, any one of us could go in and in your local public health department's database and look at a county scale view of asthma rates or lead testing rates and so forth. You can even find that out down to the census tract level. So that's a subset of obviously of a county, usually based on population. But that data does not have identifiable information related to it. By looking at a census tract, you can't tell if it has high lead, for example. You can't tell which kid had lead. You can just say, well, somebody of the 10,000 people, on average, they have a certain amount of lead in them. Once you start getting health data and collecting it yourself, it does become protected, and you have to be very careful about protecting the rights of the people who are part of that. And there's certainly training requirements, the city requirements, which are just training to make sure that you know how to handle human health information. There's an institutional review board process, which actually examines your protocol and will tell you a number of things. It will help you build in protections if you are using health data, or even if you're actually working with communities themselves, whether that's surveys or taking biological samples. And that process is very important and it's required. And there's finally data requirements. You can't just have people's name, their age, their gender, and some disease diagnosis on your laptop walking around the streets. You have to separate that identifiable information from the data as soon as possible, and do various techniques like aggregating to make sure that their rights are protected. Finally, the challenge, and that's what I think many of you will face, and there's many ways to overcome that, is getting data from health, criminal, or other institutions. A number of these institutions, like clinical practices or hospital networks, have a significant amount of data. They're not just going to provide the data on a drive or upload it onto Google Drive for you to just take. In fact, that's pretty sensitive. So you typically have to get this institutional review board approval, and for that, I would suggest getting mentorship on that, and I'll explain that in a second. And then you approach the hospital networks, you approach the criminal justice system or other institutions like schools, and ask them to partner with you and sit down and work with them. This is how I've received a lot of blood-led information from various areas, is working with our hospital network, showing that, you know, I have this institutional review board approval and so forth. Now, all of this is all well and good, and it might seem daunting because there's some words you haven't heard of before, but how did I personally get into it? Was I able to just do it the day after conceiving the idea? No, of course not. I sought mentorship on my campus from a number of faculty in the medical school. We happen to have a medical school on campus, and from the School of Public Health. I sought mentorship from the National Institutes of Health. I sought mentorship anywhere I could find to learn how these processes work, because they become really, really important to bridging the divide between environmental sciences and health. So what worked, what didn't, what next? I'll tell you one thing that worked is by engaging with communities. I not only have community partnerships that are stronger a decade later than they ever were, but I also have thousands now of samples from people's backyards and community gardens and so forth that are now in our own databases. We've given the information about what those samples found back to the residents, but we also publish freely on that data. This is what's called citizen science. And in this case, both sides get the advantage of having a dense network of environmental samples at the personal level, which you couldn't get if you just happened to be, you know, sampling in a few parks that are allowed or so forth. Not only that, but the people took the samples themselves, so they actually became part of the process, and so they are starting to learn about environmental sciences without actually even knowing that they're learning about it, and they're learning about how a scientist might conceive of a sampling technique, and they're doing it themselves. Is it perfect? Do I know that every time that they're supposed to be taking one sample from near their street, one sample from their yard, and one sample from near their drip line, that that is exactly where they take it? No. The information is still valid for them, and in terms of my side, the research side, that would be problematic if I only had 10 samples. When you have thousands, you start to normalize to the mean actual value. What didn't work, I'll tell you a couple things that didn't work, is that it's very difficult for somebody who's not used to applying to and arguing for grants from different agencies to do that. For example, from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation, who funds a lot of health research, from the NIH, who funds a lot of health research. And so I've had to learn quite a bit and also just be mentored through that process. I've been successful now, but that part's not easy, and I won't sugarcoat that. What next? I want to give you a snapshot into where I see the area of GeoHealth going in the final couple slides, to show you kind of where we're going with it. This is an example of a project that we're launching locally, but we are pursuing internationally. It's called the Healthy Cities Project. Our partner here is the Kepra Institute, an amazing group of people who helped us promote the video resources and the visual resources to explain how you go about sampling soil. So I won't have us go through the video in the bottom right, but you click here and there's one of our young citizen scientists who explains how you sample soils. And the reason why this is important is this is somebody from the community. And so not only does the community hear a voice that is of the community, but this young man now has learned about science, and this person is incredible and has gained some agency himself in learning how to engage with the scientists and with the public. This Healthy Cities project has allowed us to evolve new tools to map out the distribution of various contaminants in the environment. This is just one snapshot from a tool that we're in the final stages of developing. This is just a map of soil lead values from one particular type of house in Indianapolis. There's something like 2,000 data points altogether with 6 different metals, but I want to just focus on this one because working with community partners, we got input onto how you want to portray this information. And what they said is, hey, we want it like the air quality index, AQI, when we want green light for okay, yellow light for caution, and red and deeper red for problems. And so this is the kinds of maps that we produce now, which if you hover over any of those dots, it gives you the actual data. And as you zoom in, you can get very close. We do protect human data with this individual data because all of these spots are jittered by about 2 blocks every time this page is reloaded. So you don't know exactly the house that this is from, but it's adequate to show you community level exposure and then start taking steps to eradicate that source of contamination. We can also play with adding on different tools. This is the same map of soil lead values for one household type, overlain by Census Bureau data on the percent of poverty in that neighborhood. So it shows those areas that, like on the north part of this map, where percentage of poverty is pretty low, yet they still have a pretty high amount of soil of lead exposure. Or potential exposure, that might take a different kind of messaging than some of these areas in darker colors that are real problematic, but it also helps shape for us our next sampling. For example, there's a lot of dark spots on there, so low socioeconomic status census tracts that are completely undersampled. And so those are now the targets of community partnerships we're building to sample in those potentially vulnerable areas. We've also developed a international dust analysis project. We know that a lot of exposure comes from dust, and we are now asking for dust from inside homes. This is a partnership with Australia, the UK, and Hong Kong, and IUPUI is the North American hub. So we're starting to ask citizen scientists to be part of this other approach where they send in dust, and we do the same thing. We analyze the dust, and we are able to publish off of those results and add new toolkits, but we translate the results back to people. Here's an example of one of these dust analysis, and this is unfortunately this individual, as you see from the top bar, has extremely high lead inside their homes. This isn't the kind of graph that you would normally see in a scientific figure or a scientific journal, but this is the kind of graph you see, for example, in your medical records for your blood pressure or amount of hemoglobin or something, where it's a bar scale and it's relatively easy to understand. Finally, we are in collaboration with some partners developing some citizen science toolkits to further internationalize at least the lead screening part of this, and also we're adding in some dust work. The picture on the left is I have a project in Kabwe, Zambia. It's considered the most polluted country on the planet, polluted city on the planet, and we're working on lead mitigation techniques and home-based sampling out there and sampling kits. On the right is a colleague, Francisca Landes, and also Lex Van Geen from Colombia, who are using this citizen science little instant lead screening tool for in Peru, to mining communities in Peru, to help really focus in on the neighborhoods. So in conclusion, I would like to reiterate the fact that the bridge over to GeoHealth is not quite as long and treacherous as you might think. There are mentors all around you. For example, the GeoHealth section is free to join, and there's ample opportunities in the fall meeting or others to learn more from other experts in the field who are beginning to make this step, this bridge over. I'd like to urge you, as you are, that remember that you are dealing with health issues, and these people are people that you're focusing on. So I always try to keep the human bit in my own mind. I am not looking at children as statistics. They're not rocks. They are human beings. This is one kid who's severely lead poisoned in Kabwe, and he's a human that will forever be affected by this. So I think of this as an important backdrop to how I pursue my own practice. So I would like to thank you all very much for listening, and I encourage you to pursue GeoHealth in all of its forms in the future. Thank you very much.